I'm Tony Ruiz of Gold Derby here with Breton Vivian, who is one of the composers behind the new series 1923. And Breton, this is, you've worked with your co-composer Brian Tyler on Yellowstone and on 1883. But I feel like it's almost kind of stating the obvious that this is a very different sound. And I assume that that was an intentional choice that the two of you made.
Yeah, I think that was part of the tricky thing going in onto the show, is that firstly the story is way more varied in its locations, and we go to Africa, and then we go to this very, very bleak indigenous school for girls, a Catholic school. And so there was definitely discussions about where we wanted to take the music, and then also how far do we take it where it's no longer sounding like Yellowstone anymore. So we sort of needed to have it feel different, but also the same, and sort of living within that world. So that was kind of the tricky thing going into this to this series.
Is that an interesting challenge for you, or is that almost does it feel sometimes confining to have to work within this parameter of, we tend to not think of creativity, particularly when it comes to music, as having to necessarily fit into a mold, but does that make the challenge more enjoyable?
I think, yeah, I really enjoyed that aspect of the show. And I think in a way that having these constraints really helps creativity, I think, especially for me. I think that when okay, now we need to have something a bit different, but also the same, it starts to, it starts to make you more creative, start thinking a bit more out of the box, and try and do something different, but the same at the same time as well.
It's interesting. I was listening to some of the tracks earlier, and one of the things that I noticed is kind of this these kind of different sorts of, it almost sound like percussion elements, but I assume that they come from a variety of sources.
Yeah, there's a lot of, I mean, it depends on where you are, because a lot of the Montana stuff, we used a lot of metals, bowing bowls, metal bowls, and hitting like these scrap metals. There was something about that sound that felt very appropriate to, working out in the elements and, out in the wild. And but however, if you're in Africa, there's a lot more, one of the instruments we use is an ngoma, which is a drum from Tanzania. And so that was another important aspect of the Africa stuff, was having instruments that were actually from East Africa, where the story takes place, because a lot of what you might consider the sound of Africa tends to be instruments from West Africa. And so you're thinking of like the djembe is a prime example from the West Coast. And so for us, an important thing was to keep it on the East Coast and have it in countries that are present within the storyline.
What was your kind of exposure to that type of music before? Was this all kind of new to you, or was it a result of research?
To be honest, I love Jeffrey Oyema. He's a Ugandan writer, singer-songwriter. Also, Ayuba Gada. He became a very big influence because he is actually from Kenya, and so his main instrument of choice is something called a nyatiti, which is it's a lyre, sort of a plucked lyre that's strings going over a bowl, which has a goat pelt on it, and is a very distinctive sound. And we ended up using that in a lot of the cues that basically in that area. And really, when you first establish Spencer and his trip out he goes to a safari encampment, that is one of the key instruments there. And so, yeah, definitely those two songwriters, composers were huge inspirations to me even before going into the show. And so it was actually really lovely to be able to incorporate that sound into our compositions.
It's always fascinating to me, the concept of composing for a show. You want the score to be supporting the story, But a lot of composers I've talked about, it's like that the best compliment they receive is when the audience doesn't necessarily notice the score. Are you kind of that same school of thought?
I feel like I am and I'm not, because there's times where you need it to say something, and I do understand that point of view, especially with people who aren't really keyed into the film composing world, and don't necessarily. They might say they love a scene and can't put their finger on why, and it's probably the score or some other aspect. I definitely feel like for me, it's always about being tasteful. You can go in and try and do the most complicated piece of music, and it just doesn't fit the scene at all, or on the flip side, making it too simple. So I've always been a big fan of you know having the music say something, being tasteful, and not overstepping the story, and actually telling the story musically in a way that makes sense.
So in a co-composership like you and Brian, how do the two of you work together in terms of, is it like a delegation, or is it really just a full-on collaboration throughout the whole process?
Yeah, so I like with 1883, we started at the script stages, and so we were given a few of the earlier episode scripts, and so we already knew where the story was going, and we were already talking about what do we want the music to say, how do we want it to sound, and really we start researching, getting instruments together, recording stuff, writing stuff, themes that might be appropriate for certain character arcs and things like that. And then it's really a case of just hearing each other's stuff, and sort of having a back and forth on what we think is working, what is not. And then also when you start getting the cuts and start seeing early footage, you start to really get a sense of the tone. I think sometimes it's a bit more difficult when you've got a script, because you might think a tone's going somewhere, and it ends up not being quite the case. So yeah, so after we start getting the scenes, and that's when we really dial it in. And as you're going along, it's really the story that is just inspiring you, and helping you make decisions.
Are the scores, particularly for this show, are they written for full orchestra?
Yeah, there are. So it's full orchestra, but there's also times when it's like a few key instruments, and a lot of that will be us recording ourselves, because this story goes from really wide vistas to really big, like there's a elephant charging at you kind of scenario, and then there's real emotional moments with this is one of the big things about Taylor's writing that I really love, is that he's able to really dial it down to just a very, very dramatic moment. And so in those situations, the music has to really kind of, pull back quite a lot. And in those cases, like, we really enjoyed the sort of intimate sound of just very small ensembles and a few key instruments here and there that help underscore what is happening in the scene.
In terms of the instrumentation, one of the things that I read somewhere is there a use of, not just in the Africa stuff, but in particularly even in the Montana stuff, or in the Teonna sequences, are you looking at older instruments as well to get certain sounds?
I think older, do you mean like they were built a long time
Yeah,
ago, or do you?
yeah. Maybe
Yeah,
not. Maybe you need a
well,
certain instrument to create a sound of a certain time period.
right. Well, so for the Teonna stuff, that was really tricky, because we had to really think about well, it's really tricky because it's a really important story, and it's also something that needs to be said. And I think that what we wanted to do was to not not cheapen the moments, because they're very hard and bleak moments that talk about an oppression of a people. And so for that, what we came up with was you know, basically the way we got to where we went to was thinking about how religion was being used, misappropriated, and used as an excuse to oppress a certain, a tribe of people. And so what we decided to do was to use an organ. And so something that is very religious, very synonymous with religious music, and you know, have it be dominating the scenes. And we would affect it like by adding, distortion onto it, playing clusters with it, and really just manipulating the audio in those sorts of scenes to really highlight the fact that this is, an abuse of power, an abuse of religion to be horrible to people, basically.
Yeah, it also brings up, I think, the use of technology in composing. I mean, how has the change in technology, we're very much a long way away from, writing notes on a staff anymore. How does technology factor into kind of like your process?
I mean, it's vital. Like I don't think it's become so vital that when we're sending stuff, we're sending mocked up versions of what will eventually be recorded. And so even when we're at a stage where directors and producers can hear where you're going with the sound very early on, and for better or worse, but it's sort of, it allows you to really communicate where you're wanting the sound to go, and for them to be able to hear it. So you're not going to a recording stage and they're like, well, what is this sound? We didn't agree on this, basically. And so, and it also allows you to be able to change it quickly, and to really get it right, and to remove whatever's not working. So yeah, technology really is just vital, and it adds creativity as well, because I will record a lot of samples of me playing, and then build the virtual instruments out of those samples, and then it allows you to create new textures and sounds that you wouldn't have been able to do that if you didn't have a computer and sampling and things like that.
This is Taylor has in many ways brought the Western kind of back to television, I think, in a way that it certainly hasn't been since, at least the 1960s. And Westerns have always had a certain sound, particularly music wise. And I'm curious if going back to some of your earliest work with Taylor, how much you were aware of that and how much that, has influenced the sound you're creating now.
So one of the big things that we wanted to stay clear of was that spaghetti western, Ennio Morricone sort of sound. Not because we don't like it. I love that sound, and I grew up listening to a lot of that music. But we felt that we wanted to try something new and unique, and not just copy what has been done before. And so in a way, it sort of was inspirational to us in where we don't want to go. It was sort of that inverse kind of thing. But and so that was a challenge for us, was trying to figure out, okay, where do we go differently? And one of the ways we did it was to think, oh, how about a lot of these instruments and musical cultures that were coming over from Europe, and from immigrants coming to America, and sharing the musical language with Americans at that time.
Does in working with one particular genre, in this case with Taylor, I'm curious if you've developed a kind of a shorthand with him to the point where that what he wants and how to get there. Does that make your job easier?
Yeah, I think well, he gives us a lot of trust, and so when he has been specific with notes, it's mainly because he wants to try out a certain idea. So with 1923, there's a moment where Alex and Spencer, they've eloped, and they have, Alex has suddenly woken up, and she's in free from British aristocracy, and now can enjoy her adventure. And so they decide to go off. And Taylor really wanted us to pull the music back and just have a moment of solo piano. And then suddenly the orchestra swells in with the piano. And so, there's times when he just lets us do our thing, and then times he wants to have like a very specific idea play out. And so we ended up doing that and it worked amazingly, because it really pulled everything back, so you could see the beauty of these vistas in Kenya, and all these stunning shots of them driving through the Sahara. Oh, Safari.
Does being a composer for television film, are there scores that have had profound influence on you?
So I try not to listen to film music much anymore, because I don't want to sound like everybody else. I think growing up, I loved Titus by Elliot Goldenthal. That was a big one for me growing up. It was listening to it was just really mind blowing, because just the amount of ideas in that score, and
That whole movie is mind blowing.
I know, yeah, it is definitely dialed up. And just a wonderful expression of music as well. Yeah, I've really enjoyed that.
Well, Breton, thank you so much. Everybody go to goldderby.com, make your predictions for the Emmys, and stay tuned for interviews with more contenders throughout the season. Breton Vivian of 1923, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.